are not aware of it. That was the voice of Dennis. Greg is not here this week, so Dennis is being Greg. So
just a second, Professor. Actually, the stream is not running yet.
Okay.
Okay, wait a second. Okay, right, we're on. Okay, all right.
All right. So this week's session is Paul Redding from Sydney. I'm delighted to have Paul with us in this sort of rather unfriendly time zone that he's in. But thanks, Paul, for coming. And without further delay, all yours.
Great, thanks, Graham. And thanks, everybody, for watching. I thought I'd start with a topic that Eleanor sort of put on the table last week concerning the relation of dialectical to dialectic logic, or the other way around, perhaps. And particularly Graham's point concerning, I think, Graham, you said that there was more to Hegel's dialectical logic than dialetheism, but dialetheism was nevertheless a necessary part of it, right? So I've been thinking about Hegel's logic. So I come to this from Hegel's point of view, and I'm not a logician. My logic is sort of a, amateurish, self-taught style logic. But I am interested in the history of logic. And from the Hegel sort of point of view, from working on Hegel's science of logic, and especially the so-called subjective logic in book 3 of the science of logic, I've sort of come around to the view that there's great similarities between Hegel's logic and some modern modal logics, but also more recently learning a bit about intuitionism and the type of logic that developed in relation to intuitionism. Certain parallels started to stick out for me with that. And I do remember at one stage coming across, reading a paper by, is it Jean-Yves Bézieux? Is it one of Graham's sort of crowd? And talking about relationships between dialectic and intuitionistic logic. I think he had some modified version of a type of square of opposition or something like that. And the idea was that you go around the square in one direction and you end up as a sort of intuitionist, and you go around in the other direction or something, you end up as a dialethist. I mean, that's ridiculously corrupting what he said, but I was interested in this type of relation. I thought maybe in the discussion, we might get Graham's sort of thoughts about how this might fit together. So I'm in this sort of area of the more than, the bit of the dialectic that's more than dialetheism, right? Okay. Now, also, Hegel's claims in the science of logic relevant to contradiction, the people usually look at are the ones in book 2 of the logic, in chapter 2 of book 2 of the logic, where he discusses the the law of identity and the law of contradiction and so on. And I've always found it really difficult to get much out of that. And I just read it during the week again to remind myself of why I had that problem. One of just about everything he says about contradiction comes in the form of a conditional, right? Like this passage. Now, if the first determinations of reflection, identity, diversity, and opposition have been formulated each as a principle, all the more should the one determination into which they pass over, as in their truth, namely contradiction, be grasped and enunciated as a principle. All things are in themselves contradictory. Well, it's a conditional, so it's not terribly clear how we're sort of supposed to take that. Another one, if order of precedence were an issue and the two determinations were to be held separate, it would be the principle of contradiction that should be taken as the more profound and the more essential. So it's hard to tell whether he's sort of saying, look, I mean, if you're into principles, then yeah, the principle of contradiction, but I'm not too sure that Hegel's into principles in that sense, right? He's not a type of axiomatic thinker. Appeals to ordinary experience, but ordinary experience itself testifies that there do exist at least a great many contradictory things, contradictory dispositions, etc., of which the contradiction is present not in any external reflection, but right in them. Well, again, ordinary experience, it's obviously plays a role in Hegel, but it's not terribly clear what sort of role it's going to play here. Ordinary experience has the sun rising in the east and setting in the west, and those sorts of things, right? So, and he comes up with a list of trivial examples, the most trivial of examples, above and under, right and left, father and son, and so on, ad infinitum, all contain opposition within one and the same term. Above is what under is not. Above is determined by just this, not to be under, and is only to the extent that an under is. And contrariwise, father is the other of son, and son the other of father, and each is only as this other of the other. And the one determination is at the same time only with reference to the other. Their being is one subsisting, right? Well, I think it was a favorite of the sophists to say things like, Socrates is taller than Plato and shorter than someone else, therefore Socrates is tall and Socrates is short, gotcha, that sort of thing. And clearly there's something to do with Hegel's sense of contradiction in these type of oppositions. But by themselves, it's hard to see how, statements about Fred is the father of, Martha has much to do with contradiction. So for those sort of reasons, I've always been attracted to book 3 and the subjective logic there. Everybody's favourite book always seems to be book 2. Book 2 seems to me to be what joins up book 1 and book 3, I must admit, in the science of logic. So I've spent much more time with book 3's logic and the account of judgments, the account of syllogisms, inferences, and that sort of things there. So I thought I'd try and work through a few of those and bring out parallels that I see with Hegel and Intuitionism. One of the obvious difference between Intuitionism and dialectic logic is Intuitionism denies the law of excluded middle, right? That's the basically not the law of self-contradiction. Okay, we know that negation comes in twos in Hegel, right? There's negation and then there's the negation of negation. It's the usual way these things work. And that's how it works in judgments for him as well. Something was, okay. Hegel starts, in his account of judgment, Hegel starts off with a type of very simple judgment, the judgment of Dasein or existence, determinate existence, something like that. Very simple type of perceptual judgments, right? His favourite example is the rose is red. The rose is fragrant, he sometimes says. And this judgment will go through 2 phases of negation. The first negation is it negates it in a way, he says, that it is still assumes the rose has a colour, though another colour. Right, so it's a sort of a denial, if you like to think of it this way. Someone says the rose is red and someone says, no, it's not, it's pink, right? It's a sort of a denial that doesn't challenge that the rose is something coloured, nor does it challenge that the rose is a rose, right? I mean, you could challenge both of those things. It just challenges the most obvious part of the predicate. So this is in the history of logic, this is usually referred to as internal or predicate negation, in which the predicate gets replaced by a contrary predicate. The second form of second negation is more abstract. It also negates the universal attribution of which the particular color is a particular instance, right? And it gives rise to a new logical form that Hegel calls the judgment of reflection. And it's quite clear in this type of judgment, negation is external or sentential, not internal. It's the sort that, you learn in sort of first year logic courses by putting a little tilde or something like that outside P and speaking it in the form of, it's not the case that the rose is red. Hegel calls that type of judgment a judgment of reflection. We'll come back to this sort of duality of these after a while, because it has parallels to certain other type of approaches to logic. So Hegel treats these two judgment forms as instances of a more general distinction concerning the relation of a subject to a predicate. So his theory of judgments, his sequence of judgments moves through these more and more complex forms of judgments. They all pretty well have subject-predicate form, but they alternate between two ways in which the subject and predicate are related. In the first form, as in the judgments of existence, he talks about predication as the inherence of a predicate in the subject, right? So we think of redness as somehow inhering in the rose. In the second type, he talks of it as predication as the subsumption of the subject by the predicate. Okay, so I'll leave that sort of dualism there, but I'll be returning to it to explore it a little bit more fully, and this notion of the two different types of negation and how they're going to stand to contradiction, the issue of contradiction. Now, another one of the great slogans from Hegel's Science of Logic is the idea that the syllogism is the truth of the judgment, by which I take it that he means that if you really want to know what a judgment is, think of a judgment as how it works in the context of reasoning, right, in inference. So he's trying to sort of get away from this idea of a judgment as a sort of some sort of atomistic representation of something, like a picture or an image or something like that. And he's trying to get into a more dynamic conception of judgment as a moment of an inference. This view has become popular, especially in Hegel circles, perhaps not popular, perhaps that's not the right word, it's become well known, in the version that Robert Brandom has, which he has a so-called inferentialist theory of judgment, which is meant to be an entirely non-representational account of judgment. Well, I don't agree with that. So we don't agree with Brandom's thing. I think certainly playing a role in inferences for Hegel is a necessary condition of a judgment being a judgment, but Brandom seems to take it as a sufficient condition. I don't think that's right. And I want to use the two forms of judgment to try and explore this alternative to account that Brandom had. So, okay, the syllogism is the truth of the judgment, and within the text, within the development of the judgment form, the judgment for which the syllogism is revealed as the truth is a judgment called the judgment of the concept, which is a particularly interesting type of judgment. Hegel rarely gives many examples. Here he gives two. This act is good or bad, and this house is good or bad. Now, from the examples he gives, he doesn't say it explicitly, but I take it that we're supposed to assume this, that they're fundamentally evaluative judgments, right? They're not just descriptive. They're not just saying something about like the color of the rose. They're judgments about acts or action products or artifacts. And I think he means to convey the idea that they're what sometimes are called essentially contested judgments, right? They're the ones we tend to argue about. We don't tend to argue about colors of roses and things like that too much. But, you know, we do argue about the goodness and badness of actions. We argue about aesthetics, and those sorts of topics. And I think that's, though all those things, those three features are connected up. These are sort of paradigmatic judgments for Hegel because they stimulate dispute and lead to people giving reasons for their judgments. That's how I understand it. Now, if these are prototypical judgments, then I'd say it appears that judgments in general don't accord with the law of excluded middle, because surely it's not the case that all acts are good and bad, or all houses good or bad, right? I mean, just most of the things we do every day, most of the houses we live in are pretty indifferent, right? And I think with these sorts of judgments, we tend to think of good and bad as at the sort of end of a spectrum. And somewhere in the middle is ordinary, right? Sort of -10, +10, 0, something like that. So if this is a prototypical judgment, if this is a sort of what a judgment is, then judgments don't, to me, look like they obey the law of excluded middle. Just a little bit about treating this as a type of syllogism, because I think what Hegel means by syllogism is quite idiosyncratic. I don't think it's got a lot to do with what Aristotle means by syllogism. Being the type of judgment that's argued about, the judgment is good, will come to have a more complicated structure. And this is Hegel's own example. He says it gets expanded into something like this house as so-and-so constituted is good, right? So on challenge, if I say this house is good and you say it's really shit, I say, no, look, it's good because, you know, it's got this. And that clearly is a type of, supposed to look like something like syllogism, right? This house is so-and-so constituted. A house so-and-so constituted is good. Therefore, this house is good. Now, I want to suggest that Hegel wants us to think of this not in the sort of like the Aristotelian sort of way of that. In fact, he has many times he says, look, there's nothing much to gain from those sorts of inferences, because for God's sake, you've really got to know the conclusion before you sort of, you know, get to it. And he talks of this way as the sort of the judgment is expanding into a syllogism. And so expanding into sort of like two other judgments. The house is so-and-so constituted, which is a sort of singular as a particular type judgment. And a house so-and-so constituted is good. A particular is a universal type of judgment. And I think that now gives us a clue about how to understand the duality of judgments that we looked at briefly before. So as I said, the development of judgment sort of oscillates between these two judgment forms, judgments of existence or judgments of inherence, and judgments of reflection or judgments of subsumption. In the first, a universal predicate is affirmed as inhering in a concrete subject. I think he calls them judgments of existence for reason that he means it's what you judge is something that actually is existing, right? Like it's this rose in front of me, just like it's this house that you're judging, or this act. That's the sort of judgment with negation as internal. predicate is denied in a way that necessitates some contrary predicate being true. And the other one's judgments of reflection or subsumption. A singular subject is affirmed by being subsumed by the universal predicate. I think of the first as being sort of subject-centered and the second as being predicate-centered. And he often says things like this, describes the judgment of existence as one in which the subject is the essential term. In the judgment such that the predicate has its foundation in the subject, just in the way that, you know, the smell of the rose or the redness of the rose has its foundation somehow in the rose. But it goes around the other way with the judgment of subsumption. The predicate, he says, is essential. It constitutes the basis against which the subject is to be measured and determined accordingly. I think he means something like the second type. It's like you ask the question, what's the color of the rose? Oh, red. It's that sort of idea, right? It's sort of.
Paul, Stefan has a question.
Oh, thanks, Stefan.
Thanks, Anna.
Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
no, not at all.
Can you turn back the page to the last one?
Right.
Please. Okay, so for you it goes from internal negation to external negation. But isn't it, if we look at the development or evolution within the judgment, isn't it that the judgment becomes more and more essential and determining? So the first judgment isn't determining the first predicate isn't determining the subject at all. And so the negation is the infinite negation. It tells us nothing about the subject. If I say the spirit is not an elephant, then we know nothing about the spirit or the mind. And then in the judgment of reflection or essence, it's already a stronger determination of the subject by the predicate. And in the judgment of concept, it's the real determination of the subject by the predicate. But if the second negation is external in contrast to the first negation, which is internal, it seems like that it gets or becomes, as you said, more abstract. So I think it becomes more determined, but for you it seems to become more abstract, which I don't really see.
Okay, let me maybe put it this way. I see it as a cycle. I see it as a series of cycles, right, in which at the bottom of the cycle is this positive judgment of existence, like the rose is red. At the top of the first cycle is this crazy judgment that you mentioned, the infinite judgment, which is what comes out of the double negation, what comes out of the second negation. And it needs it needs a content, and the content will. I'm sort of getting ahead of myself, I think. But the way that I see the judgment of reflection is more or less formed by the double negation, and it cuts in the judgment of what is it? The infinite judgment is something like the transition between the judgment of Dasein and the judgment of reflection. But the judgment of the infinite judgment is only set up by this double negation, and it provides a type of logical schemata for the judgment of reflection. That's how I see it working. But perhaps we can leave this to the end, because I sort of draw on other parts of the thing to get my story going. Right? But I agree. I see it as a type of loop. There's an abstractive phase and there's a phase of concretization that comes back to a type of essentialized version of the original judgment. You get back, you start off with an individual rose and you end up with the genus rose, something like that, right? And you get the genus throws through a type of series of concretizations that work in the opposite way to the abstraction. But maybe I'll leave that because my story depends on something that I haven't brought up yet. These two sort of judgments, I want to draw a parallel to a type of duality of judgment forms that you get in Boole, George Boole, the 19th century British English logician. Boole has primary judgments and secondary judgments. Primary judgment, a good example, is that the sun shines. The secondary judgment is it's true that the sun shines. And later post-Boolean logicians treated the latter as having a subject-predicate structure where the sentence expressing the primary judgment, the sun shines, becomes the subject of the secondary judgment, the predicate of which is the predicate true. Okay. So I want to read Hegel's judgments of existence, judgments of reflection as manifesting a difference that's something like that difference. But if there are two types of judgments with different logical forms, like these have, then what's the relation between those forms, right? This is the sort of classic criticism of Boole. It was one that Frege actually made when he said that in Boole's logic, you get a type of term logic and you get a type of propositional logic, and they just run in parallel and there's no connection between them. And I think it's generally thought that Boole was never able to give a satisfactory answer to that. But I want to think of Hegel as giving a satisfactory answer to that, right? As having a way of conceiving of these two judgments as related in the way that was set out in the model of the syllogism, right? In which you think of a single judgment as sort of fracturing into these two elements, one which has internal negation, one which has external negation. And I think we can give some content to these sort of phrases, slogans in Hegel, like the identity and difference and things like that, right? With this, the type of identity that he's looking at. And I've been looking for models how to think of this, and the one that I like and have been working with for some time is the one that was proposed by Michael Wolff some time ago. It was in the 80s in an article. It was in a collection. In German, it was translated in 99 in the Owl of Minerva on Hegel's doctrine of contradiction. Wolff had an interesting take on that, which I've never seen him develop in any other paper. And I've been, in some sense, trying to develop it. Hegel's approach to negation, he thinks, originates in Kant's doctrine of opposition. He says, proceeding from the insight that arithmetical negativity is not reducible to logical negation. Now, what he means by arithmetical negativity, we'll have a look at. I think that part of it I agree with. Sometimes in that article, he seems to suggest that this mathematical type of negativity has nothing to do with logical negation, which I think is wrong, right? But nevertheless, I'm following this. Okay, so for those of you who maybe don't know Kant's attempt to introduce the concept of negative magnitudes into philosophy, it's an essay that was written during his transitional phase, before he officially becomes, Immanuel Kant, before the transcendental idealism. And he's moving away from Leibniz. That's the general idea. And in this paper, he addresses the very real, at the time, maybe it's still a real problem of negative magnitudes or negative numbers, right? As you probably know, the Greeks didn't have negative numbers. They only came in modern sort of 17th century mathematics with algebra. And people would say, well, what's a negative number? I mean, what's a number less than zero, right? That's just nonsense. there can be no such things as negative numbers. And this was Kant's attempt to answer it. And his answer was something like this: look, negative numbers are just a type of bookkeeping procedure. Think of a ship sailing from Portugal to Brazil. The captain keeps a log each night, and he says, today we traveled 20 miles or something like that. And sometimes in the log he'll say we traveled minus 12 miles. Why? Because the ship was being blown back by unfavorable winds and things like that. And Kant makes the point that you can't travel negative miles, right? I mean, a mile that you travel is just a mile. There is no difference. It's only a difference in this bookkeeping type of procedure. He also uses the analogy of debts and credits and things like that, right? So Kant's solution to the problem of negative magnitude seems to have inspired later developments in new algebraic forms of geometry employing vectors. And Wolff thinks that there's a continuity between these. He thinks that Hegel sort of anticipates this type of these developments. So if you think of a line segment as something that has a direction, you might have A, B here. And if you think of it as going from A to B, then you might think of it as positive in that direction and negative if it's going from B to A. And then you can sort of start a type of, primitive type of algebra where you have AB is equal to minus BA and that sort of thing. In this paper, Kant also extends this talk about negativity to concepts and attitudes to concepts, or if you like, sort of intentional attitudes. Sort of getting worried about okay, taking much longer than I thought. So he says, for these reasons, aversion can be called a negative desire, hate a negative love, ugliness a negative beauty, blame a negative praise. The error into which many philosophers have fallen as a result of neglecting this truth is obvious. One finds that they generally treat evils as if they were mere negations. That's having a shot at Leibniz, who treated evil as just a lack of goodness, right? Where Hegel's saying no, Kant is saying no, evil is kind of like a countervailing force to goodness or something like that. This is what Wolff says. Hegel actually anticipates an important idea of the newer algebra and vector algebra of Hermann Grassmann, who incidentally has studied Hegel's science of logic. Hegel provides a careful and path-breaking analysis of the algebraic concept of negativity and introduces the concept of absolute value as the concept of the substrate of logical reflection. Now, it's that last bit that I want to sort of try and make some sense of. Okay, it's just like the idea that if you travel 10 miles, it's just 10 miles. There's no going 10 negative miles, right? There's only sort of negative and positive in the opposing senses in some other way. And the idea is going to be that there's only negative and positive judgments or opposed types of judgments given the existence of a type of substrate, which is the content of the judgment, right? So Hegel's idea of the equivalence, I think, of these opposing judgment forms, right, is going to be that, okay, so you might say the rose is red, or you might say it is true that the rose is red, right? You might have those two types of judgment forms. And what Hegel's going to say is that they've both got the same content. They're both about the same aspect of the same thing in the world, right? The rose and its redness. But they've got this type of differently expressed logical structure that play different sorts of roles. Now, I think of it as much like the so-called redundancy theory of truth, right? Which relies on the intuition that says that a judgment it's true that the sun shines says no more than a judgment, the sun shines, right? That is, they just have the same content. Now, there are aspects of Eleanor's book, treatment of content and form in her book, which I see saying something of very similar to this. That the predicate is true adds nothing to the content might be thought as redundant from the perspective of the judgment's content, but it's obviously not redundant if one thinks of these as signaling some implicit duality of logical form. Okay, so got about maybe 10 minutes. Let me try and connect up some of these ideas with so-called intuitionistic logic, which is logic that foregoes the law of the excluded middle, law of excluded middle. Intuitionism in mathematics, intuition is a sort of philosophical take on the nature of mathematics. It comes from L.E.J. Brouwer, who was a topologist around the turn of the 20th century. And the logic for it was developed by his PhD student, I think, Aaron Hating, in the 1920s. Back. Okay, and so just running quickly through a little bit about how Hating sets up his version of Boolean logic. So for conventional Booleans, right, there are two sort of laws of logical conjunction and disjunction, and they're treated as axioms. Okay, so P and Q implies P, and P and Q implies Q. And disjunction, P implies P or Q, just as Q implies P or Q. And negation in Boolean algebra is just an operation that changes the truth of a value, the truth value of a proposition into its opposite, right? So if P is true, then not P is false. And if P is false, then not P is true. Now, for various sorts of epistemological reasons to the way they think about mathematics, intuitionists don't want this framework. Going back to the Boolean way of doing it, once you've got those axioms up, you can define implication, as Bertrand Russell did, on the basis of conjunction or disjunction plus negation, right? So you say P implies Q, or if P then P, just means not P or Q, right? That's the only thing that P implies Q rules out is that P is true and Q is false, right? That's the sort of idea. Now, again, the intuitionists they want to remodel all this sort of stuff. They don't like that for, as I said, for the epistemological reasons. Hating doesn't employ the typical idea of truth and falsity as complementary in that way. So he needs another way of relating the various logical laws. So he defines negation in terms of the idea that not P as a false proposition implies any proposition. Okay, that's more or less what you find in Russell in the definition of implication, right? Now, to define negation in terms of a type of form of implication means that you then can't define implication in terms of negation. You can't use negation to define implication. So that means implication has to be defined in some other way. And I hope I've got this right. Graham will be able to set us straight if I haven't. But as I understand it, the way that it's done in intuitionistic logic is that the truth of a conditional if A then B, is itself taken to be dependent on the truth of another first order proposition. Right. So that is, given C, then you can say that A implies B. Now I take it as, it's like those sorts of inferences that people often bring up in cases like this, where you say, if I strike a match, it will burn. But that inference actually is dependent upon a fact, like that there is oxygen in the atmosphere, something like that. Right. The truth of a conditional here is dependent on the truth of some factual claim. Now, what's that got to do with anything vaguely like Hegel? Well, I think it's got a lot to do with it, actually. For one, I think it looks a bit like the syllogism that emerges out of Hegel's judgment of the concept, where the inference, if a house is constructed in such and such a way, then it is good, is actually dependent on the truth of the statement, this house constructed in such and such a way is good, right? I mean, these are like, they're akin to aesthetic judgments. We construct the rules of aesthetic judgment only after the fact of establishing sort of prototypically good judgments, right? We might sort of have rules for what constitutes good jazz or something, but you're not going to set up those rules without thinking that, like Miles Davis is good, right? If anyone knows Peirce's logic, it ties into what Peirce calls abduction, I think, which he sees it as a way of sort of setting up rules of inference and so on from first order judgments. Oh, okay, so I've run out of slides, so let me just try and finish off by saying why I think this has an important place for Hegel. The intuitionist logic is a type of logic that's designed for a world in which not everything is determinate. Not every question has to have an answer. Not every claim has to be true or false, or even for the claims to make sense that they're true or false, right? There's just living in a sort of a world with a whole lot of indeterminate facts is the way that many intuitionists and sort of developing these ideas think of intuitionistic logic as applying there. Boolean logic, or sort of classical logic, seems to be designed to apply to a world in which everything is determinate, in which every proposition has a truth value. Now, it might be thought that, okay, we don't know those truth values, but from a classical point of view, it's like they have a truth value. Like somebody knows them, must be God, something like that. Right? Intuitionists want to have a much more sort of open fabric type of not totally determined world, but they also want to be able to set up hypotheses or sort of theories in which you can say, well, if it's the case that there's a whole lot of things, like if this hypothesis is true, then such and such things should follow. I think that's the way that Hegel thinks of the relation of logic to the type of more, going from the more sort of practical concerns of everyday life into these more constrained theoretical contexts, right? So we want a type of logic of indeterminacy, I think, for everyday notions of agency. That's an idea we get from Aristotle's famous example from De Interpretatione about tomorrow's sea battle. You know that, right? And he says, we ask the question, will there be a sea battle tomorrow? From Aristotle's point of view, it doesn't have a truth or falsity, right? It's not that it doesn't have a truth or falsity until tomorrow for Aristotle, right? Whereas from a Stoic perspective, of course, it's either going to be the case tomorrow that there's a battle or not. It's just that we don't know it. Aristotle seems to want to have a much open future, as it were. and notions of agency and things like that. No, everyday notions of agency seem to need that sort of open future. Similarly, Hegel wants logic to be both practical and theoretical at the same time, and I think it needs this type of openness and openness to human agency and so on. That's why I like this type of parallel between the sort of ideas that you get in intuitionism and Hegel's logic. But okay, I've said enough for that, so stop that.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Well, you've left us plenty of time for discussion. So, okay, those are clapping hands, I think. Right. Who would like to lead off the discussion?
So I have perhaps two questions, but so thank you very much. I think it's very difficult. I think the task of mediating between Hegel and logic in general, and then between Hegel and non-classical logics, is a very difficult task, for me at least. And I think, yes, I think that the idea that there are intuitionistic elements in Hegel's dialectics is very well grounded. There are authors that defend a view of Hegel as an intuitionistic logician. But what I haven't understood, but perhaps I think you can, you're going to tell us more in the discussion, because it was something that you said at the very beginning of your talk. So I didn't understand in what sense what you say about Hegel's logic, namely, so that according to your interpretation, links it to intuitionism in intuitionistic logic. So I haven't understood because why it doesn't link it to paraconsistent logics, because so but at the very beginning of your talk, you said, you quoted the article by Geneviève Béziot, who said that there are links, there are connections between intuitionistic interpretations of negation and possible paraconsistent interpretations of negation. So, so my question is then concerning, so what do you think, because I'm not a logician, but in my so my prejudice about or my assumptions concerning intuitionistic elements in Hegel's logic concern the meaning of negation. And so the point is, how do you interpret double negation? So what do you think about Hegel's? So first of all, Hegel's use of double negation and Hegel's omnis determinatio est negatio. Can you tell us a bit more about that? And if you think that there are connections between the intuitionistic use of double negation and Hegel's use of double negation and Hegel's conception of omnis determinatio est negatio.
Yeah. Yes. Appropriately very difficult questions, Helena. Thank you. I see negation in Hegel as effectively three varieties, right? The one that Wolff calls mathematical, the opposition, right? That's manifested in conceptual distinctions like good and bad, right? Which has elements both of contrariety and contradiction about them, right? Because like contradiction, you narrow it down to two, which is important. The contrariety of, say, different colors, you know, there's lots of them, right? So it doesn't have that same sort of structure. Opposition has this type of, well, you know, I think of it as predicate negation and sentential negation are sort of somehow aufgehoben, right, into this idea of these strong contrary oppositions like good and bad, up and down. They're all the ones that he mentioned, by the way, in that strange thing about fathers and sons and blah, 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 the type of list of, what is it, you know, Aristotle's table of the Pythagorean opposites, so like up and down and left and right, and, you know, the moon and the sun and all these sort of things. So I see that as the encompassing structure, and that it's meant to explain the relationship between predicate negation on the one hand and sentential negation on the other, in terms of this, well, taking it from Wolff, the idea of there being an absolute substrate of such of judgments that are opposed in that sense. Right? We're now not talking about opposed judgments as in this is red, it's not red. No, I'm talking about opposed judgments in the sense of a judgment that says something about the rose within the framework of a type of predication that invites internal negation, and a judgment that says something about the rose within a framework that invites external negation, right? So as I tried to convey, I take that in that sort of Boolean primary secondary distinction, right? One of them is about these sort of immediate judgments. The rose is red. The other one is like, let's say you sort of went through some long process of reasoning about, you know, a thing that was in a room, and that, you know, you've got all sorts of clues about it, but no one's ever seen it, and you'll by these sort of chain of reasonings, you'll come up and say, it's a red rose, right? But it's been so mediated, you know, as it were, the path of reasoning to it has been so mediated that it'll have a very different status to a judgment like looking at a rose and saying the rose is red, right? It'll have this type of, it is true that, and there's the proposition, that's the true proposition, right? It's those sorts of judgments that I want to see as having the same content, the content being just the world, right? Well, what it is in the world that those two judgments are trying to say something about, but they're saying something about it in different ways. The judgment forms in which that bit of the world is being talked about are different. You know, like some people say things like, you know, to say that the rose is red is to say that, you know, the world has a certain property, and the property is that the rose is red is true of it. Something, you know, this is highly type of abstract way of talking about things. It's got nothing sort of to do with experience of roses and whatever, right? It's that sort of distinction. It's the sort of, you know, Salesian manifest world, scientific world type of distinction. It's that sort of, that's the type of matrix that I see Hegel as working his way through. The double negation thing is great because, of course, both intuitionists and Hegel reject the law of double negation, right? Because Hegel wants the double negation to take you somewhere, right? You don't get back to the starting point, you get to somewhere new. Like when you go around this sort of cycle of, I think, increasingly abstract judgments and then increasingly concrete judgments, you started off talking about the world as containing roses, and you end up talking about the world as containing a particular natural kind or something like that, right? The rose as such, a particular natural species or something like that, right? And that kicks off another cycle of similar sort of, both that second cycle comes around and ends with now the judgment of the concept, right? But I see both cycles, and this is perhaps sort of going back to Stefan's question, I see both cycles as having phases of abstraction and concretization. And that's allowed by these two different judgment forms that you can sort of oscillate between. You're taken from very concrete judgments of particular things to very abstract judgments that subsume, or if you like, say true or false things about those things. You're taken through, that allows you to connect those judgments in traditional sort of logical ways, conjunction, disjunction, all that sort of stuff, with a whole lot of other judgments. And you end up redetermining what you're talking about. First, it was just a rose, like everybody knows what a rose is. And then you end up with, well, this is a sort of a botanical species with all these certain sort of properties and so on, right? So you end up with a much more complex thing that you're talking about. And what allows that to happen is this the way that abstraction from this rose allows you to bring this rose into a whole lot of connections with other things in the world about which you say things like are fragrant or are red or something like that, or have color, right? And to do that, you need to abstract. You need to get to abstract. You need to get to abstract universals, right? Whereas you start off with the redness of the rose that you see. Hegel actually says it's singular. It's singular, then it becomes particular. It becomes this like a particular color that you can contrast with other particular colors like yellow. And then it becomes an abstract universal, something under which you subsume things or say, you use to say true or false things about a whole different range of things, right? So red in that abstract sense, you not only say about roses, but, say about buses, telephones in the old days. It allows you to bring things in the world into relations, sort of rational relations, with a much broader range of things, but that depends on abstraction. If maybe I just then come back to another aspect of Stefan's thing. See, the so-called infinite judgment, I just said that is an infinitely indeterminate judgment. Right? Why is it infinitely indeterminate? Well, you've abstracted away from all the sensory properties of the things, right? You've gone from red as a singular sort of, to something like red as a very abstract concept, which you might think of as reflects light rays of certain frequencies or something like that, right? I mean, it doesn't have the type of feel of redness left in it. And you're just left with all these abstractions that are connected up. And I think Hegel's making the point is if you think of that type of structure as self-sufficient, you'll just get nonsense out of it. You've just lost everything. You've lost all determinacy. That's why you have to see those abstract judgments as standing in a type of paired relationship with the concrete ones, that they've got the same, they're about the same stuff. If you don't think of them as connected in that way, you'll just end up in with empty words. I think that's how he thinks of Leibniz. I mean, if you think of the section in the syllogism, when he talks about the Leibniz's mathematical syllogism, the type of judgments he's talking about there are more or less the same judgments that he was talking about in that section on judgment as the infinite judgment. And he says there that they're just, because they've lost all their sort of subject predicate character, they've just lost their content entirely. Right? So that's the cost. The cost of abstraction is ending up with meaningless symbols. That's why abstraction always has to be held in this type of relationship to concrete judgments with some sensory content. That's where I think the Michael Wolff image of a substrate, a judgment substrate with, as it were, opposed judgment forms is a nice way of capturing it. Does that sort of go anywhere towards answering that?
It's clarifying. I have just very small questions, historical question about about Grassmann and hating.
Right. Yeah.
And I just wanted to know. So you explained the connection between Kant and Hegel. Right. And I know that Intuitionism was also born from a reappraisal of Kant. So I assume that these authors knew Kant. Did they know Hegel? Do they refer to Hegel?
I don't know enough about the history of Intuitionism at all. I mean, it's usually said that because, I mean, Brouwer's a topologist, right? So he's on the end of the 19th century that's gone through all the new forms of geometry. So Kant's take on geometry can't stand, right? I mean, Kant thinks Euclidean geometry is this type of, is forever geometry, right? So the way that Brouwer deals with that is just dropping space as from intuition. The intuition within which the mathematician thinks is entirely temporal for Brouwer, right? And he thinks Brouwer's weird. I mean, he thinks that concepts are just, I mean, this is a bit Kantian, right? Concepts and intuitions are entirely distinct, right? But there's only one intuition at a time. And concepts have got nothing to do with mathematical truths. Concepts are just for the communication of mathematical truths. What the mathematician relies on is pure intuition, these sort of structures of intuition. It's very sort of bit Husserlian, you know, Husserl was into this sort of stuff too. So no, I had no idea whether he'd read, any one of those people had read Hegel. But just on the Grassmann thing, it's terribly interesting because a number of people have made, besides Wolff, have made connections between Grassmann and Hegel. The so-called categorical logician Levier, this guy in sort of category theory in maths, he's big on the idea that category theory is a sort of combination of Hegel and Grassmann, and he thinks that Grassmann is sort of Hegelian. Grassmann was a student at the University of Berlin in Hegel's years there. Grassmann was there in 27 to 31 or something like that. But he never did any courses with Hegel, and he did every course that Schleiermacher put on in that period. An absolute fan of Schleiermacher. The other thing about Grassmann, he didn't do any maths at university. I mean, he was supposed to be, he saw himself as a mathematician, and He went to university. His father was a school maths teacher. Went to university, did no maths, did all this stuff with Schleiermacher. And then he wrote this book, which was like, ended up transforming, you know, mathematics, turning it upside down in the 19th century. But nobody could read it because it was written in this, he said it was dialectic. He had a dialectical framework. But I think the dialectical framework he had in mind was Schleiermacher. But on a lot of that stuff, Schleiermacher and Hegel are quite similar. They sort of played up their differences because they hated each other. I mean, they're political opponents and all that sort of stuff. But if you read some of Schleiermacher, he's got lectures on dialectics, and they're terribly interesting. And they're sort of, there's a lot of shelling in them, right? But there's a lot of shelling in Hegel too, I think.
Okay, I think at this point we should move the discussion on
sure.
because there's a queue building, and I'm a bit worried that we won't get everybody who wants to ask a question in. So can we move on at this point?
Please.
Okay, Michaela.
Hi everyone, thank you Paul for your talk was really stimulating, dense, and I really need to think more about various points of the paper. I have a simple question. I read Michael Wolff's book 15 years ago, so I'm not sure I remember, because I think that paper was the English version of some idea published in the book Der Begriff des Widerspruchs, where Wolff was thinking about all the many ideas in mathematics of that time, in order to read what was going on in the doctrine of essence.
Right.
My doubt was about the relation between the doctrine of essence and the doctrine of the concept, especially the theory of judgment and syllogism. Because when Wolff was thinking about the relation between mathematics and the idea of absolute substrate and the doctrine of essence, he was trying to find a kind of conceptual instrument for explaining what was going on with the essence determining itself in appearance, and so the relation between the negative and the positive, and the three kinds of relation between the negative and the positive, right? I'm trying to remember, not sure I'm right. And so there was the relation between the negative and the positive as negative, and then as indifferent, and then as the negative in itself and the positive in itself. And so it is a very specific dialectic, and I was wondering if we can really apply that same idea of absolute substrate and the way in which it works, I think, in a certain way for reading what is going on in this doctrine of essence. If you can apply this same dialect in order to explain a different kind of negation, which has to deal with the structure of predication or with the structure of proposition. Because I think that maybe my question is, can you really think of that reading that you presented with respect to the doctrine of judgment and syllogism to a more general conception of contradiction, and more specifically to what you mentioned at the beginning? And so when you quoted the famous line of the doctrine of essence, everything is inherently contradictory, self-contradictory. Because my impression, but I'm not sure, my impression is that we are dealing with different sorts of negation. That's why I'm really always so uncomfortable when people ask me what Hegel means by negation. So my answer normally is you need to read the whole science of logic. Because when we are in the doctrine of essence, we have a negation that affects the content of a category, which is something different from what we find the theory of judgment and the theory of syllogism. But it's a doubt. It's not really a question. It's a comment, which is not. And so, and a brief question. That quotation at the beginning, everything is inherently contradictory. If we eliminate the conditional, and so the reference to the principle form, this proposition, is it true, false, or without true value? So thank you.
Thanks, Michaela. Really, really thoughtful reflections on that. Look, I tend to think of the structure of the 3 books of the logic. I mean, I made that sort of silly joke about, the logic of essence is how you get from book 1 to book 3, that sort of thing. But I mean, Franca made a comment in the first week that that struck me as where, I mean, as you go through the sort of the vocabulary that Hegel has got to discuss these things is becoming richer and richer, right? So, you start off with being and nothing, right? There's just not a lot you can do with those notions, right? It sounds pretty, cool to say things like being becomes nothing and nothing becomes being, but I mean, there's not a lot there. But when you get to the end of book 2, and it dawns that possibility is nothing, right? I mean, it's quite literally, possibilities are nothing. They're not being, they're nothing. And actuality is being, or something like that. And the relations between actuality and possibility are it's very rich, very, I mean, like modal metaphysicians sort of, so think about this for forever. So what you've seen is a type of enriching of the vocabulary as you go through. And to me, that sort of carries right through, right? So I take it seriously that you get takes on ideas about negation, contradiction, and so on in book 3 that I don't think that the vocabulary or the conceptual apparatus exists for back in book 2. That's the way that I sort of tend to think that, you're constantly, I mean, the dialectic is sort of working in such a way that you're sort of getting to a conclusion that forces you to look back and see your premises, as it were, in a very different way, and in a richer way, right? And the word that he uses is, I've forgotten. He uses a word that's sort of like begeistert, something like that, enriched, whatever. So I mean, I guess I tend to think, I often wonder whether it's worth struggling all that much with those difficult parts of the essence chapters, rather than thinking, well, look, let's just sort of keep this in mind and see where it's going, what we can think of this from later down the track. And I think the subjective logic, subjective logic is sort of largely ignored by a lot of people who write about the logic, because they just dismiss it as a bit of sort of amateur Aristotelianism or something like that. And I think it's anything but. I think it's quite a sophisticated type of logical apparatus he's got there. I mean, his logic, the logic teacher at Tübingen he wasn't the teacher when Hegel was there, but he was still there. They used his book, Pluquet. John Venn, at the end of the 19th century, said that Pluquet and Lambert were the 2 most important logicians of the 18th century. That's a pretty big thing to say. Right now, that's where Hegel's getting this sort of stuff, right? You can get you can get Foucault's texts that they used to teach in the courses at Tübingen. And it's not just recycled Aristotelian syllogisms. It's quite an interesting type of, it's very influenced by Leibniz, right? Very influenced by Leibniz. So Leibniz is sort of like, as you know, Leibniz is sort of like Boole. He anticipates a lot of Boole. So it's not, I don't think it's unusual. One should find these things in Hegel. But I just think it gives us a bigger vocabulary to try and make sense of those difficult bits in Hegel. So I'm certainly not trying to sort of just extract out the bits that you can formalize in Hegel and say, oh, this is the bits worth keeping or anything like that. Certainly not. But I do think it's worth the effort of thinking about Hegel's subjective logic in using logics around that are sort of somehow approximated, right? Peirce, I think, is very similar to Hegel. Peirce thought he was quite similar to Hegel in a lot of ways. And the category theory, if you think of the first two books as sort of category theory, right? Sort of like, a bit like Aristotle's categories. Bringing in the subjective logic is a bit like bringing in Kant, right? It's bringing in Kant thinks of, well, you get the categories out of the judgments, that sort of thing. I think that there is that dimension to it, right? I think it does give us a sort of a richer way to think about the sort of transitions going on earlier and the sort of meaning of those transitions and things. But I guess I don't want to. I mean, I've got very different, very definite views about the logic that I don't share with a lot of people. I mean, I don't sort of accept the usual interpretations of logic. So part of my desire to sort of reconstruct it from the framework given in the subjective logic is got that interest behind it.
So do you want to come back on that, Michaela?
I was just curious about the second question about the sentence, everything is inherently contradictory, if it is true, false. So,
I think it's true or false?
Or without true value, if we eliminate the condition.
Well, I don't think Hegel's idea of truth is the truth of the word truth value, right? I think truth values are what he describes as correct and incorrect, which have a role, which do have a real role in everything, but he wants to keep true for something like necessarily true, I think. Does he think it's true? Yes, but let me put it this way. I think he thinks, but I don't think he thinks it's a principle. In that place, he's talking about it as a principle. Right? Yeah, that's a cheap way of getting out of it. But I think that, I think I'm happy with that.
Okay, next person on the queue, Franca.
Now, sorry, I have a connection, an oscillating connection, so I'm not able to. Thank you, Paul, for this very insightful contribution. I have basically two questions. But first of all, I want to thank you for recalling what I think is the main point. We are used to thinking that there is a difference between Hegel's logic and contemporary logic, but this is not exact. The big difference, in my view, is between Hegel's conception of truth and contemporary logician conception of truth.
Right.
In a sense, I think that, well, the mention of the Hegelian Aristotelianism is correct because Hegel is by far closer to Aristotle than to logicians, contemporary logicians. This is my intuition.
Yeah.
Well, now my questions are about about the Hegel as an intuitionist logician, and the second is about the difference between external and internal negation. The two questions evidently are connected. As to the first question, don't you think that, well, exactly the point of truth is important because intuitionistic logic is or can be interpreted as being an analytic logic, a logic without truth. Because instead of true, the truth predicate, intuitionism includes the provable, demonstrated, and so on.
Sure.
And this is a big difference, I think, with respect to Hegel, because in the traditional idea, and I think also in Hegel's idea, maybe, but I'm not sure because I am not so expert on this, an idea of logic without truth is inconceivable, totally inconceivable. This is my intuition, but I'm not sure about this. And another aspect is that if you accept truth in an intuitionistic view, you are an epistemicist. So in a sense, you must reject the unrestricted application of the T-schema and all this. I'm not sure that Hegel can be interpreted as an epistemicist. As to the second question is, what do you think about it? And the second question is about external and internal negation. Can we interpret this as the difference between, well, respectively, calling of external and internal negation? One is, it is not true that external negation, it is not true that the rose is red. Yes. Okay. Yes. Yeah. And in that case, we have negation accompanied by truth. Okay. And in the other case is the internal negation of when you say the rose is not red, and which means it could be yellow, it could be, so is contrariety more than contradiction. And this second negation allows for contradiction because it is the internal negation of true contradictions for Hegel. Is this, does this fit to your reconstruction in a sense? It seems to me, but I'm not sure.
Right, thanks very much, Franco, and that's really, really helpful. Look, yes, I don't want to give the impression that I'm saying Hegel is an intuitionist, right? I mean, I'm trying to find bits of intuitionism within it and find a place for them, and it's in you're right that there's no for an intuitionist, truth really just means proven, right? There's a witness that I have experienced that makes this true. Now, the parts of Hegel's account of judgments that to me, look like intuitionism are ones where he doesn't use the notion of truth, right? He uses the notion of correctness. he says that there's no, that, you know, that there's no truth in these, that the rose is red. There's only correct or incorrect. Now that seems to me fits with the sort of, you know, a place for a type of intuitionistic way of thinking. I think I'm not too sure. I think intuitionists like Brouwer are sort of foundationalists, right? Brouwer thinks that intuition can give you mathematical truths that will last forever. I don't think Hegel wants this type of judgment to play anything like that role, because he wants to use this I think this interaction between internally and externally negated sort of judgments to redetermine the whole conceptual configuration of them, right? That's the point. It allows you to, you started off with the idea, you might have, you know, you started off the idea, you know, you might have thought a rose was, I don't know, some strange sort of animal that looked like a plant, right? And going through all the sort of mediations to, you know, what you can say of roses and all that, you end up with it's a plant, right? So our concepts get continually redetermined. That's what I like about Hegel's way of thinking about logic, right? It's nothing like a foundationalism that you build things up on. You're continually undermining assumptions and replacing them with better ones. So yes, it could. I mean, no, truth is going to be a real, going to play a real role. But I don't think, let's see. I mean, the way we talk, or the way contemporary logicians talk about truth, I think is really, really weird, right? It doesn't coincide with everyday life. I mean, there's, I'm interested in, you know, the debates that went on between the Booleans and Russell and people like that around the turn of the century. And there's this great guy named Hugh McColl who had a little book on logic that has very Hegelian features. It's got the type of oppositions in them, right? The sort of good bad type of oppositions. McColl had an example, Mrs. Brown is not at home. And Russell denied that that could be true or false, right? I mean, he denied it could be true or false because it's not a proposition. It's a propositional function. What's it, you know, it's a type of predicate. What's the subject that it's predicated of? It's a point of time, right? Well, this is absolutely, nobody uses truth in, you know, in the world in that way. And McColl's response was something like, saying that is saying like Mrs. Brown is a different person when she's not at home to when she is at home. So, this type of highly abstract idea of truth that you get as there are these things called propositions, and propositions have two properties of being true or false, the property of being true or being false. And propositions exist in consistent sets, or, you know, this sort of stuff. The notion of truth bound up with that, I think, this just has very little to do with reasoning. And I think that's, to me, Hegel's point about the type of judgment that Stefan raised, the infinite judgment, is precisely that. I mean, you abstract away in this type of radical way to get something that looks like a modern proposition, looks like something that Frege would call a proposition. And then then you say, well, yes, we'll build the semantics up by having truth values and all that sort of stuff. And then you sort of wonder how it all hangs together with experience or whatever. I think Hegel's a great critic of that. And so you certainly need truth, but exactly what the notion of truth comes out as, where you can locate it in contemporary discussions of truth, I think is very difficult to say. There's an element that he wants to incorporate, I think, of truth as correctness. He wants to include that. He wants to include the truth as having a truth value sort of thing, because he wants to use the type of logical leverage that you use with true and false in that sense. He wants to have something like necessary truth, I think. But I don't think what he means by true comes out in any one of those things, or it's unclear what combination of those things comes out to. But,
okay, what about Franca's second question?
I've forgotten, sorry, what was the...
It was, she pointed to your distinction on internal and external negation,
right. Yeah.
and asked if I understood it right, whether it's external negation that might be the ground for true contradictions. Have I got it, Franca?
Yeah, implicitly, yeah. There's, once one focus on truth, one has also the answers to other
right. Okay. I guess I think of external negation as typically the type of negation that the notion of contradiction is made for. Right? It's the sort of the diagonals on the square of opposition.
Well, the question was about the possibility of interpreting external contradiction, external negation, sorry, as a negation accompanied by truth. So it is not true that, while the internal negation is interpreted as simply not. The not of the rose is not red.
Yeah.
Can we interpret a Hegelian difference in this way? That was the question. But
right. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. But I think you already gave.
I think of the internal negation as just limited negation. It's just limited to a part of the judgment, the predicate, the most superficial part of the predicate. And leaves everything else intact. That's how I think of internal negation. External negation just puts everything up for grabs, right? External negation, it may not be red, it may not be coloured, it may not be even a rose, right? It could be anything. And that's why you get those weird judgments in, in the infinite judgment about, what is it, the elephant's not a chair or whatever. There's sort of category states, I take it. And I think what external negation has done is shred off the categories. There's no subject. There's no natural kinds for external negation. It's no longer this rose is red. I mean, it's just not, and then you have a proposition with no internal distinction between a thing's essence and its accidents or anything like that. And that I take it as why Hegel thinks that is so empty. You've just stripped away all the stuff that reasoning and truth and that are dependent on.
Okay, good. So the clock is ticking down and we still have two people left in the queue. So let's move on. Stefan.
Yes, thank you for your talk. So I have two questions. One is you were referring to the sea battle example, but isn't the logical issue in the immediate judgment different and more closely connected to an issue the medieval logicians raised in their Sophismata? Namely, the question, is a proposition like man is an animal still true if there's not an animal or a human being existing anymore? And some of them, like Ockham or Seeger, would say, no, it's not true anymore. It's untrue now, because there's no reason to argue that it's true anymore. We cannot show something. And this seems very close to the immediate judgment, which is the immediate, the judgment of Dasein, because in Encyclopedia 1870, in the annotation, he says, it is one of the most essential logical prejudices that such qualitative judgments such as the rose is red or not red can contain any truth. So he seems to go even further than the medieval logicians like Ockham and say, this judgment isn't true at all because we cannot give any rational reason for it. We can just say, oh, look at it. And this is what he says if I'm saying, oh, it's raining outside. Tomorrow, he says, this judgment has become dead or rotten or whatever he says, because I cannot point to it anymore.
Yes.
And the concept or the judgment of concept is a judgment I can give a rational reason for it. Yes. If I say, this is not a good knife, you can say, why is it not a good knife? And I say, oh, because it is not identical with its concept. Like, why am I not a good human being? Because I'm a liar and so on. And so I'm not identical with the concept of a human being. So this is my first question. I don't think that he refers to the sea battle example, but to another issue. And the second thing is, how do you think the concept of negation changed? Because in the infinite judgment, it seems like Leibniz, who says, for example, it is a metaphysical evil for me that I don't have any reality. Like that I don't have wings is a metaphysical evil. That my dog cannot talk is a metaphysical evil. The medieval and antique philosophers would have said this is complete nonsense because by my nature or my concept, I am not supposed to have wings. I'm supposed to be a zoon logon echon. I'm supposed to talk, to speak, and so on. And so the negation in the infinite judgment is a very abstract negation. You can negate everything from me, but in the judgment of concept, it has become a privation or a steresis. So like the negation of blindness, if I don't see, you can say, oh, I am blind. This is a very determinate negation because you can only say that things are blind if they are, by their concept, supposed to see. Like human beings are supposed to see the mole, perhaps, or not. That's a big discussion. And so it seems like the negation changes from a very abstract negation. You can say that I am not an elephant, I am not an apple, I am not a rat, or whatever. But then it turns into a privation, which can only be predicated in by this process structure if we look at the concept. I don't know if it's clear what I'm saying.
No, I think I've got you, but I guess if we go back to the beginning, no, of course, there's no sense in which judgments like the rose is red is going to play some important role in the inventory of truths. But it seems to me that if we go to the judgment of concept, it's hard not to see the judgment of concept as bringing back, as it were, the good bits that he wants to save about judgments about roses, and the good bits that he wants to save about judgments about this genus rose, right? I mean, I take it that the problem with the intermediate judgments, the judgment of necessity, isn't it? The second sort of cycle that you go through that starts off with the subject of the sentence is the kind, right? The rose as a kind. The problem with that is that we've lost singular instances of those things. We're just talking about the kind. And I take it that the importance of the return of singular instances of things in the judgment of the concept, these evaluative judgments, is that there's no sense in which you can say this house is a good house without experiencing the house, right? i.e. being in its presence, walking around it, having contact with it. And that's the sort of immediate contact that we started originally with. Yes, it was a sort of an ill-fated, failed type of simple judgment back then, but its failure led to all this interesting stuff about kinds and species and laws connecting them and so forth. And that's what we can, when we get to these really meaty sorts of judgments, like the judgment concept, we've got that type of conceptual, armory or whatever, vocabulary. We've got those sort of conceptual connections that we've inherited from working through the other things. But we've returned to sort of the concrete type of instance of the thing again, right?
Wouldn't you say
we might, it could be, this rose is good, right? Because it could be, you could be at a floral contest or something like that. All their life's efforts of breeding roses has gone into this peculiar rose, right? It's got something of the original judgment. The rose is red. It has to have something of that. It's just got it in a much more complex environment of connections between concepts that allow you to say what roses are or what roses should be or something like that. So I don't see I don't think it's just that we can keep on getting further and further and further away from those original judgments. That's why I tend to see it as a type of looping structure where you sort of bring back concrete experience of things, but in a different sort of environment, in a different context. It allows you to say different things about them. But the mode of judging, it's not like the mode of judging sort of gone. It's just been incorporated into some richer set of practices or something like that. So I don't know. Does that answer your worry about the initial starting point?
Yeah, kind of.
Do you want to come back on that, Stefan?
Oh no, I'm fine. I'm good, thank you. Or perhaps one thing, hasn't the status of singularity changed between the first step, where I say the rose is red, and the last step? Because the first step, I just take it as this rose, and the last step, once we have integrated the judgment of necessity, we kind of take it, perhaps we can say, as a manifestation or a specification of the concept. So okay,
sure, absolutely. But it's still singularity. It's still a thing. It's still an existent that you have to come into contact with, and coming into contact with, being in that sort of relationship means it's sort of it's not a judgment from nowhere, right? It's that, that sort of that type of idea, Leibniz's idea, you sort of climb up the ladder of conditions of conditions of conditions of conditions, and if you could get to the top where God is, you've got it all laid out in front of you. I think that Hegel's very much against that type of imagery. And it's still coming back into the sort of deepening your understanding of singulars, right? As you say, they manifest or fail to manifest or something like that in natures or how they should be. But there's still something of the original judgment form there, I think. It's not.
Okay, So I have myself in the queue, and given the time, this probably be the last question. So pretty central to your talk, Paul, was the question of the law of excluded middle and Hegel's attitude with respect to it. Okay,
Right.
and of course, excluded middle fails in intuitionistic logic. It fails in lots of other logics too, not just intuitionist logic. But no, your question was about the attitude of Hegel with respect to the law of excluded middle. And Hegel actually has a discussion of this, which you probably know, but let me remind you of it. I'll tell you where it is exactly. It's in Book 2, Chapter 2. And the chapter is called, at least in one translation, The Determination of Reflection. And in section 3 of that section 3 is about opposition. And then remark 2 there is about excluding middle, right? And I think that encapsulates his view of excluding middle. Let me read it to you. Bear with me, because it's not short, but I can't just, the important bit's right at the end, but I've got to read you the rest to get there,
Sure,
okay?
sure.
So the relevant passage starts with a statement of excluding middle. Nothing is A and not A at the same time, unquote. What this implies is that there is nothing which is not either A or not A. So it's rephrasing the statement, that there is no third that will be indifferent to that opposition. Okay, but in fact, a third indifferent to it is given in the principle itself. For A itself is there. This A is neither plus A nor minus A. So it looks like a reference back to the Kant, which you reminded us of, okay? This A is neither plus A nor minus A, and just as much also plus A and minus A. The something which ought to have been either plus A or minus A is here attached to the plus A as well as the minus A. And again, in as much as it's attached to the A, it ought not to be attached to the not A, just as it ought not to be attached to the A in as much as it is to the not A. Okay, so it's verbose, but he's saying, yeah, there's this third thing, A itself. Okay, then we get to the more business end. The something itself, the A, is therefore the third thing which ought to have been excluded. Since in this something, the opposite determinations are equally posited and sublated, that third, which is here in the shape of an inert something, which, taken more profoundly, is the unity of the reflection into which the opposition returns into its ground. Okay, let me read that last sentence again because it's important. Since in this something, this third thing, the opposite determination is equally posited and sublated, that third, which is here in the shape of an inert something, when taken more profoundly, is the unity as a reflection into which the operation returns into its ground. Okay, so that, then he moves on to something else. Now, what's going on in this passage? Well, look, it starts as though he's going to deny excluding middle. And he actually sort of comes up with an example of something which is neither A nor not A, it's A itself. But when you get to that very remark at the end, what he suggests is this. The A is something which you abstract from the judgments. So that judgments have a polarity, affirmation and negation, or affirmation and denial, okay? But there's something which lies beneath the polarity, namely the thing which you're judging about. You know, the A itself. You can either affirm it or deny it. And that last sentence says that when you think about what's going on, this proposition itself, prior to affirmation and negation, is the sort of ground of judgment. So it looks as though it's starting off as an objection to excluding middle, but it isn't. It's saying that once you see what's going on, you're led to another category, the proposition itself, to put it in modern terms. And so you're not, in the end, denying excluded middle, because excluded middle is about judgments. You know, you can either affirm the proposition or you can deny it. And nothing he says in the end gainsays that. The point is rather that when you think about what's going on in excluded middle, it takes you to something new, namely the ground of excluded middle. And so it turns out not to be a denial of excluded middle, it turns out to be the ground of excluded middle. At least that's the way that I read this passage.
Thanks, Graham. I know that passage, and I've never thought I've understood it. I don't think I understand it now. I don't. Okay, look. Okay, I think you've got a good point. That I think I've probably conveyed something too coarsely, talking about the law of excluded middle, both with respect to Hegel and Intuitionism, because I don't think Intuitionism doesn't deny the law of excluded middle. It simply doesn't affirm it. Right? I mean, I've heard Intuitionists make that point.
Sure.
They don't deny it, they just don't affirm it. So it's not, it doesn't count as some sort of axiom or principle. And it can be invoked. You can bring it in under a hypothesis, right? I mean, in the way that you convert Hating's logic into Boole's logic, right? It just, okay, given these conditions, the world will work classically, sort of thing. That's their argument, I think. And I think, yes, if I've said or implied that Hegel denies the law of excluded middle, I think that's wrong, right? I think I was wrong in saying or implying that. That's not what I wanted to imply. I just wanted to imply that his attitude to these things isn't as finding out a set of axioms that you can lay down which regulate thought. There's a place for principles, to bring them up, and then you find that you've overstepped them, and then you have to reflect on their limitations. That's as I see his way through these things. So yes, it would be, he's not a skeptic about these things, like deny this and deny that. And the only way that you can discover the limitations of anything, I think, in his way, is to take it on and try and see how far you can go with it. Now, Vernunft can't avoid the toils of Verstand, right? You've just got to, you can't do Vernunft in sort of first person. I'm thinking the logic of reason now. I've left the understanding behind. You've just got to pursue the understanding, and that means adopting principles and so on. But they're always held in a type of fallibilist way. That's how I understand the system to work. So it would be very unwise to say that he was denying the law of excluded middle. And if I gave that impression, then it was. I'll have to be much more careful. So thank you.
Yeah, he's certainly. I think he's actually happy with the excluded middle in the end. I think he is quite happy not just not to deny it, but to affirm it.
Okay.
But anyway,
then how would that sit if we took the prototypical judgment as the house is good? I mean, that doesn't look like the type of judgment that has to be true or false. There's lots of, Hegel surely doesn't think that every house is good or bad.
No, but sort of bad is the contrary of good, not the contradictory. So he might well say every house is either good or it isn't.
No, he certainly won't say that, because it's got to be this opposition. I think Michaela wants to come in.
Can I just one brief thing? Can we say that according to Hegel, the law of excluded middle is richtig, but not wahr? So it is richtig and unrichtig. It is correct and not correct. I don't remember the English translation for that.
Yeah, correct.
Because
yeah,
in a certain way, it explains part of the way rationality works, but it is not enough to say what Hegel wants to say in the science of logic.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that we always need to distinguish when we are dealing with the law of contradiction, the law of excluded middle, these two level of these two ways in which Hegel talks about truth, Richtigkeit und Wahrheit, correctness and truth.
Yes.
Which is something the passage Graham mentioned about the law of excluded middle. I think that Hegel is talking about the law of excluded middle in relation to essence. And so that was the sense of my question at the beginning. I don't know in which sense you can apply that very observation about the law of excluded middle to what Hegel is doing in the theory of judgment. But of course, we would need the other 2 hours to discuss about this. So I just want to thank everyone.
Okay, let me give you the last word, Paul, then we're going to have to wind up.
Well, I don't think I have a last word. Thank you, everyone, for the great questions. And it's been a very helpful discussion from me. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Paul. Dennis, I don't know whether there are any questions on YouTube, but we really should wind up at this point because I know people have other things to do, such as go to bed. I'm going to go out and get a haircut. Okay. Next week it's Anthony in my list. Anthony, are you there?
I am, yeah. Sorry, I've had the video off. I'm here.
That's okay. So you're up next week, mate. Okay.
That's right.
Good. So we look forward to that. Have a good week, everybody, and see you next week.
Thank you.